Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the incredible 2,000-year journey of one of the world's oldest institutions and its complete transformation on the morality of violence. Seriously, it's a story packed with radical reversals that might just redefine how you think about change.
All right, so to really get this, we've got to start with where the Catholic Church stands today, because honestly, it sets up this huge, stark contrast with its own history.
So back in 2018, Pope Francis made a huge change to the Catechism. That's the official book of Catholic teachings. He declared the death penalty inadmissible, and that word is key. It means it's unacceptable in all cases, no exceptions. The reason? It's seen as an attack on the fundamental dignity of a person.
But wait a second. This modern view seems to completely contradict, well, centuries of history, right? I mean, this is the same institution that launched the Crusades, that ran the Inquisition, that even had its own official executioner. So, you have to ask, and this is the core of our whole explainer, how on earth did we get from there to here? How did this massive change happen?
Well, to really understand this revolution, we have to rewind. I mean, all the way back to the beginning. We're talking about a time when the Church first had to figure out what it even thought about violence from a religious perspective.
And here's something that might surprise you. For the first 300 years or so, Christianity was largely pacifist. You know, a lot of early Christians flat out refused to serve in the army. But then, everything changed. Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and suddenly, it was tied to the military needs of a global superpower.
So, they needed a solution. And it came from a brilliant theologian, St. Augustine. He came up with what we now call just war theory. And the core idea is this: war is always a tragedy, but it could be morally necessary to bring back peace and justice. The catch? It was only okay under super strict, very limited conditions.
And this is so important to grasp. The original point of these rules was to make war harder, not easier. It was all about restriction. A war had to be declared by a real government, not just some random warlord. It had to be for a really good reason, like stopping a grave injustice. And the goal had to be peace, not just conquest or getting even.
But, as you can probably guess, that original restrictive idea didn't last. What happens next, over the course of 1,000 years, is that this theory gets stretched, twisted, and, well, corrupted into something else entirely. Okay, this is the turning point. When we get to the Crusades, those original rules get turned on their head. Just cause is no longer just about defense. It becomes about offense, about reclaiming territory. Legitimate authority to call a war, that shifts from kings and emperors to the Pope himself. And this is the wildest part. The right intention isn't about restoring peace anymore. It's about getting a spiritual reward, an indulgence for fighting. And once you make that theological shift, it's like opening the floodgates. This new way of thinking justified centuries of church-approved violence. It turned the Crusades into, believe it or not, a holy act, a way to achieve salvation. And it also gave the green light to the Inquisition, which was basically a court system for hunting down and punishing heretics. Now check this out. The Church had this internal rule that its own clergy couldn't shed blood. So, to get around this while still executing people, they came up with a pretty clever legal loophole. The Inquisition would find someone guilty of heresy, condemn them to death, and then hand them over to the secular arm, the local king or prince, to do the dirty work of the actual execution. This way, the Church could say, hey, our hands are clean.
And don't think this was just some abstract idea. This was very, very real. The popes ruled their own territory, the Papal States, and they had their own executioner. One guy, Giovanni Battista Bugatti, was the official papal executioner, and his records show he personally carried out 516 executions on behalf of the popes. 516.
Okay, so this long history of the Church being directly involved in violence, that eventually begins to fade, but it gets replaced by a totally different and maybe even more complex moral challenge in the 20th century.
You see, the Church wasn't really starting wars anymore, but it shifted into a different mode, one that was focused on protecting the institution itself, on its own survival. And that policy, well, it led to some huge moral failures when faced with the absolute horror of 20th century violence. A prime example? In 1933, the Vatican signed a treaty with Nazi Germany. It basically guaranteed the Church's rights to operate, but the price was political silence. And that silence pretty much continued throughout the Holocaust. We see a similar, tragic pattern decades later, with the public silence during Argentina's dirty war in the 70s, even though the regime called itself Catholic.
In the end, it was the trauma of 2 world wars and the absolute unimaginable horror of the Holocaust that finally forced a reckoning. It was a breaking point. The old ways of thinking about war and violence, the old justifications, they just didn't work anymore. They couldn't hold up against the reality of industrial-scale slaughter.
And you could actually trace this pivot to nonviolence as it happens over decades. It really kicks off in 1963, right after the world came to the brink in the Cuban Missile Crisis, with a major document that called peace a basic human right. From there, it's a steady progression, step by step, all the way up to that final decisive move in 2018 when Pope Francis made the death penalty inadmissible.
But here's the thing. This new theological position on nonviolence didn't just appear out of nowhere. It happened alongside something else, something really unprecedented, a public attempt by the Church to actually face up to its own violent history.
Pope John Paul II especially led this charge. He started this formal process of apologizing for the sins of the past. And we're not talking 1 or 2 apologies. He issued over 100 of them. He publicly asked for forgiveness for the violence of the Crusades, for the silence during the Holocaust, for the way heretics and indigenous peoples were treated. It was a massive undertaking.
So why do all this? What's the point? Well, it's all about credibility. By confronting its own dark history, the Church is trying to regain its moral authority to speak in the modern world. There's a recognition that, if you want to be a credible advocate for peace and human rights today, you first have to own up to the times you were on the wrong side of history.
And that leaves us with one big final question to think about. After this incredible 2,000-year journey, from justifying holy war all the way to condemning state-sponsored killing, can this modern revolution in thinking actually redefine the legacy of such a long and, let's be honest, often violent history? It's a question that really gets to the heart of what it means for any massive ancient institution to truly change.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to plunge into some really complex histories and pull out the key insights you need to understand the bigger picture.
And today, wow, we're tackling a huge one, a 2,000-year history filled with, well, a fundamental contradiction.
Yeah, it's this paradox at the heart of the Catholic Church's relationship with violence, isn't it?
Exactly. We're tracing how an institution that started out, radically pacifist, its earliest followers, actually refused military service, seeing violence as completely against the gospel message.
Right. They saw it as incompatible.
Totally. Yet that same institution, over centuries, evolved to the point where it was actively sanctioning, even launching and carrying out some of the most, well, devastating acts of organized violence in Western history.
It's a really jarring journey, from that absolute nonviolence then to justifying war, then even holy war, and eventually kind of circling back in the modern era to completely rejecting state killing.
It is. So our mission today is to trace those huge shifts chronologically. We need to look at the specific theological moments, the institutional changes that allowed the Church to okay mass death.
And then also that more recent moral revolution, the one that brought Shuan dignity right back to the forefront as, like, a firewall against violence.
And our sources really give us a critical step-by-step look at this whole transformation. We'll track it from that early fidelity to the Gospels through all the political compromises, especially in the Middle Ages.
And land on the modern arguments against capital punishment, which are quite definitive now.
Yeah. But to really get why it collapsed into violence, we first have to unpack the foundation, the just war theory that maybe unintentionally made that later corruption possible.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The patristic era, you said, the first, 3 centuries or so?
Roughly, yeah. And the sources characterize this early period by a really widespread stance of pacifism.
What was driving that? Was it purely theological, or were there practical reasons too?
It was definitely rooted in trying to follow Christ's teachings pretty directly. Turn the other cheek, love your enemies. But there was also a very practical side.
Okay.
Well, military service in the Roman Empire often meant participating in emperor worship or other pagan rituals. Idolatry, basically.
Ah, right. So it clashed with monotheism.
Exactly. Early Christian writers, people like Tertullian or Lactantius, were quite clear on this. They argued a Christian simply couldn't wield the sword in military service.
So baptism and being a soldier were seen as incompatible.
Largely, yes. For those first few hundred years, Christianity really defined itself, in part by being separate from the state's machinery of violence.
But that separation couldn't last, could it? History moves on.
It doesn't. And the big shift happens when the Roman Empire itself starts to become Christianized, especially after Emperor Constantine in the 4th century.
So Christianity goes from being this sometimes persecuted minority religion to suddenly being intertwined with the state. It becomes a partner, in a way, in governing. And that creates a massive theological headache because now they have to deal with defending the empire.
Precisely. How do you protect a now Christian empire without completely tossing out those core gospel teachings against violence? It forced a need for some kind of ethical compromise.
And this is where Augustine comes in. St. Augustine of Hippo.
Yes, around the turn of the 5th century. He provides the intellectual framework for this compromise. This is really the birth of what we call bellum astum.
Just war theory.
Just war theory.
Yeah.
And the sources really stress this. Augustine's whole framework was meant to be incredibly restrictive. It started with a strong presumption against war.
So war wasn't seen as good, but maybe. Sometimes necessary. A necessary evil.
Exactly that. He argued it could be morally permissible, maybe even an act of justice or love, but only if its ultimate, sincere goal was to restore peace and order. It was never, ever meant to be glorified.
Okay, so how did he try to ensure it stayed restrictive? What were the rules?
He laid out the initial criteria for jus ad bellum. That's the justification for even starting a war. And we really need to grasp these initial 4 criteria, especially the first one, to see how things went wrong later.
Okay, walk us through them. What's the first one?
First, legitimate authority. War could only be initiated by the sovereign, the recognized head of state, the emperor, the king.
Why was that so important?
Well, it was actually very pragmatic at the time. Think about the context. Lots of feudal lords, local barons, constantly starting their own little private wars. This rule was designed to stop that chaos.
Ah, so it centralized the right to wage war, trying to limit it to just the big players.
Exactly. Make it a rare state-level decision, not just constant local fighting. Centralization as a tool for limitation.
Okay, that makes sense. What's number 2?
Second, just cause. The reason for the war had to be incredibly serious. It had to be about righting a grave wrong, like recovering stolen land, defending against attack, or preventing some imminent massive injustice, not just any grievance.
So a high bar for the why. What else?
Third, right intention. The motive behind the war had to be pure. The goal truly had to be achieving peace and justice, not driven by hatred, revenge, greed, or just a desire for conquest.
That seems hard to judge, maybe. But okay, intention matters.
It does. And finally, fourth, proportion and last resort. This meant you had to exhaust all peaceful options first. War was the absolute last choice. And critically, the good you expected to achieve by fighting had to clearly outweigh the terrible harm and destruction the war would inevitably cause.
That proportionality piece seems huge, especially thinking about modern warfare.
Absolutely. Even back then, it was a crucial limiter.
Okay, so those are the 4 original pillars, but you mentioned the first one, legitimate authority, had this unintended consequence.
Yes, and this is where the critique in our sources really digs in. The idea was to restrict war to sovereigns only. But what happened over time, especially as the papacy gained enormous political power in the Middle Ages, was that popes started arguing that they were the ultimate sovereign, the supreme legitimate authority, even above kings and emperors.
Oh, so they took Augustine's rule, designed to limit war to kings.
And flipped it. They used it to say, actually, we, the popes, have the ultimate authority to declare war. By the High Middle Ages, this allowed them to justify launching offensive wars, like the Crusades, simply by issuing a papal decree.
Wow. So the very rule meant to restrict war became the justification for the church itself initiating wars.
Precisely. The seed of restriction, through institutional ambition, became the root of expansion and eventually holy war. It's a critical turning point.
Before we get to full-blown holy war, though, the church developed other ways to exert power, right? Methods our sources call soft violence.
That's right. Before directly wielding the sword in large campaigns, the church perfected these incredibly powerful spiritual sanctions. They were tools of political coercion that could be, frankly, more effective than armies.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
The 2 big ones were excommunication and the interdict.
Okay, excommunication sounds familiar. Kicking someone out of the church.
Essentially, yes. It was like a spiritual death sentence for an individual. A ruler or any person could be barred from receiving the sacraments, communion, confession, everything.
And that mattered. Why, politically?
Hugely. In that era, being cut off from the church wasn't just about your personal salvation, which was terrifying enough. It often had the direct political effect of releasing that ruler's subjects from their feudal oaths of loyalty.
Whoa. So it could destabilize their entire kingdom?
Absolutely. If the Pope excommunicated a king, his barons might suddenly feel free to rebel, claiming he was no longer a legitimate Christian ruler. It was a massive threat to political stability.
Okay, that's powerful. What about the interdict? You called it the nuclear option.
It really was.
Yeah.
Because the interdict wasn't aimed at one person. It targeted an entire region, a whole population.
What did it do?
It suspended all public church services across the board. No masses, no baptisms for newborns, no church weddings. And this was the most terrifying part for people back then, no Christian burials.
No Christian burials. In a time when everyone believed that was essential for getting into heaven.
Imagine the psychological pressure on the population. Their babies couldn't be baptized, their marriages weren't blessed, and their dead couldn't be buried with the proper rites, potentially jeopardizing their eternal souls. All because their ruler was defying the Pope.
The pressure on the ruler must have been immense. Mass panic, potential revolt.
Exactly. If a king or prince let an interdict drag on, they risked a massive popular uprising. Their own people, terrified for their souls, would demand they give in to the Pope.
So the church could basically compel secular rulers to do what it wanted, often without raising a single soldier itself.
That's the key point about this soft violence. It demonstrated the sheer political force the church could wield through spiritual authority. It showed they could enforce their will on temporal matters.
And you're saying this success, it kind of paved the way.
I think our sources suggest that. Successfully using these coercive spiritual tools built institutional confidence. It showed the church it could deploy its centralized power to achieve political goals. That confidence, combined with a theological loophole in legitimate authority, set the stage for justifying actual physical military coercion later on.
Okay, so the stage is set. The church has confidence. It has a manipulated theological justification. Now we move from just war, bellum justum, to something different, holy war, bellum sacrum.
Right. And this isn't just tweaking Augustine's rules. It's a fundamental corruption. The idea shifts from war being a regrettable necessity to restore peace.
So war being a positive moral good, something holy in itself.
Precisely. And the absolute clearest, most tragic example of this is the Crusades.
Starting with Pope Urban II's call in 1095.
Yes, at the Council of Clermont. What Urban did was revolutionary and, frankly, deeply problematic theologically. He didn't just authorize a war using just war principles. He reframed the entire act of fighting. He declared that fighting and killing the enemies of Christianity, specifically Muslims in the Holy Land at that point, was not just permissible, but spiritually meritorious. It was an act of piety, a holy duty.
And this connects to the idea of the indulgence, right? This is crucial.
Absolutely critical. The plenary indulgence, this changed everything about sin, penance, and violence.
Explain that. What did it offer?
Okay, so traditionally killing someone, even in what might be considered a just war, was still seen as a grave sin requiring serious penance, fasting, prayers, pilgrimage, whatever.
Right. You still dirtied your hands, spiritually speaking.
Exactly. But Urban II offered crusaders a plenary indulgence. This meant the complete remission, the wiping clean of all the temporal punishment due for their confessed sins.
Temporal punishment, like time in purgatory.
Essentially, yes. So by taking up the cross and fighting in the crusade, the act of violence itself became the penance. If you died fighting for Christ, you were basically assured of bypassing purgatory and going straight to heaven.
That completely flips the script. Killing becomes a path to salvation, not an obstacle.
It does. And think about how that corrupts Augustine's criteria, especially right intention.
Yeah, the motive is no longer about restoring peace for everyone else. It's about my personal salvation, my spiritual benefit.
It becomes entirely self-referential. Exactly. The sources often lay out this contrast starkly.
Okay, let's see it. How did the criteria switch from Augustine to holy war?
Well, just cause.
Right.
Augustine's was defensive or reactive, getting back stolen territory, stopping an attack. Holy war's cause became expansive, offensive, the recovery of the Holy Land. This was driven by theological ambition, not immediate self-defense.
Okay, cause changes. What about authority?
Legitimate authority. We saw this coming. It shifts entirely from the secular ruler, the king, the emperor, to the papal declaration itself. The Pope becomes the war starter. Popes like Urban II or later Innocent III were the ultimate military authorities in Christendom for these campaigns,
Centralizing power in the papacy even further.
fundamentally undermining the original restrictive intent. The church isn't just blessing wars anymore, it's initiating them and reaping the political and spiritual rewards.
And the consequences were immediate and brutal, weren't they?
Horrifically so. The First Crusade, for example, ended in 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem. And contemporary accounts, even allowing for exaggeration, describe a truly terrible massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants.
But the violence wasn't just over there in the Holy Land, right? Didn't it erupt in Europe, too?
Yes, even before the main armies properly set off. You had the Rhineland massacres in 1095, 1096.
What happened there?
Basically, bands of zealous, often undisciplined, people got fired up by the crusade preaching and decided to start early by attacking Jewish communities in German cities like Mainz and Worms.
So the enemies of Christ were suddenly much closer to home.
It showed how dangerously flexible that term could be. Once you spiritually sanction violence against the other, the definition of other can expand rapidly. These pogroms show that theological justification could easily unleash localized fanatical violence, overriding any real political control.
And this sanctioned violence wasn't always directed outwards. It could turn inwards, even against fellow Christians.
Tragically, yes. This brings us to what Pope John Paul II later called the Mysterium Iniquitatis, the mystery of iniquity.
He was referring to?
Primarily to the Fourth Crusade, around 1202 to 1204. This crusade was called by the very powerful Pope Innocent III, initially aimed at Egypt.
But it didn't end up there, did it?
No. Due to a complex mix of financial problems, political maneuvering by the Venetians, and internal Byzantine politics, the crusade got massively diverted. And in 1204, the Western Christian Crusaders ended up brutally sacking Constantinople,
the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Christian world.
The largest, wealthiest Christian city in the world at the time. They sacked their fellow Christians. It was an act of staggering violence that permanently damaged relations between the Western and Eastern churches and cemented the Great Schism.
It demonstrates that once holy violence is unleashed, it's hard to control where it points.
Extremely hard. Internal theological disagreements, political rivalries, they could suddenly become justifications for violence just as potent as fighting external enemies.
Okay, shifting from military campaigns. The church also developed internal mechanisms for violence, didn't it? The Inquisition.
Right. The Inquisition wasn't initially one single entity, but more of a judicial procedure developed in the 12th and 13th centuries to investigate and prosecute heresy.
Heresy being seen as a threat not just to the church, but to the whole social order.
Exactly. Groups like the Cathars in southern France were seen as dangerous dissidents, undermining both religious and secular authority. The Albigensian Crusade was fought against them, combining military action with inquisitorial procedures.
And these procedures, they involved coercion.
Increasingly, yes. While the initial goal might have been conversion or reconciliation, the Inquisition fairly quickly came to accept and eventually rely on physical coercion torture to get confessions.
Things like the rack, which we associate with the later Spanish Inquisition.
Those methods became infamous later, yes. But the principle of using state-sanctioned pain to enforce theological conformity was established much earlier in the medieval Inquisitions.
But there was this crucial legal workaround, wasn't there? The church itself didn't technically carry out the executions.
This is the concept of the secular arm. It's absolutely key to understanding the institutional self-justification going on here.
Explain that mechanism. How did it work?
Okay, so church law, canon law, held to the principle ecclesia non sitit sanguinem.
Which means?
The church does not thirst for blood. Or, more practically, the church does not shed blood. This meant that clergy, who were the judges in Inquisition trials, were forbidden from actually carrying out a death sentence themselves.
So if they found someone guilty of heresy and that person wouldn't recant, what happened?
If the ecclesiastical court condemned someone as an obstinate heretic, they would formally relax the person.
Relax?
It's a euphemism. They would hand the condemned person over to the local secular authorities, the king's officials, the town council, whoever held civil power, the secular arm.
And then the state would execute them, usually by burning.
Typically burning at the stake, yes, as that didn't involve the direct shedding of blood fitting the legal fiction.
So the church judges condemn the heretic, knowing full well what will happen.
But they hand them over to the state for the actual killing. This allowed the church as an institution to maintain this facade of, well, moral purity. Our hands are clean, we didn't shed the blood.
While still effectively using the state's power of execution to enforce religious doctrine.
Precisely. It's a masterful piece of legalistic maneuvering that allowed religiously motivated capital punishment while preserving the church's claim to abhor bloodshed.
This era of sanctioned violence seems to reach a dreadful peak with the wars of religion following the Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely. The Reformation in the 16th century shattered the thousand-year religious unity of Western Europe. Now, you had multiple versions of Christianity, each claiming to be the only true path to salvation.
And that belief in exclusive truth fueled conflict.
Massively. Both Catholic and the new Protestant states often operated on the assumption that the opposing faith was not just wrong, but dangerously heretical and needed to be stamped out, often by force.
We see this in specific horrific events like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre.
Yes, in France, 1572, started in Paris and spread. Essentially, it was a wave of targeted killings and Catholic mob violence directed against Huguenots, French Calvinist Protestants.
How many died?
Estimates vary wildly, as they often do for events like this, but somewhere between 5,000 and maybe even 30,000 people were killed across France over several weeks. It wasn't really organized state warfare in the traditional sense. It was religiously fueled mass murder of civilians, encouraged or at least tolerated by parts of the Catholic leadership.
And then this escalates into full-blown international war, the 30 Years' War.
That's the ultimate catastrophic military expression of these confessional conflicts. It starts in 1618, initially rooted in the Holy Roman Empire, with the Catholic Habsburg emperors trying to reassert control and impose religious uniformity on Protestant states within the empire.
But it spiraled out of control.
Hugely. It dragged in almost every major European power. Sweden, France, Spain, Denmark, turning Central Europe into a wasteland. It lasted 3 decades.
The devastation must have been unimaginable.
Millions died, not just from fighting, but from the resulting famine and disease. Some areas of Germany lost huge percentages of their population. The sheer scale and brutality were unprecedented.
And ironically, it's this extreme violence that leads to a kind of resolution.
Yes, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which finally ended the war, it didn't create religious tolerance as we know it, but it did establish the principle that the ruler of a state could determine its official religion. Cuius regio, adis religio, effectively ending the idea that religious uniformity could or should be imposed across Europe by force.
So the very horror of the religious wars led to a political agreement that limited the church's ability to use state power for religious enforcement.
In a way, yes. It marked a recognition, born of utter exhaustion, that trying to compel religious belief through warfare was futile and catastrophically destructive. The age of large-scale confessional wars in Europe largely ended there.
Okay. So we've seen the church justifying war theologically and compelling states to execute heretics. But there's another layer here we need to address directly. The time when the Pope wasn't just influencing rulers, he was the ruler.
Exactly. The Papal States. This is a crucial distinction we have to make.
How long did this last?
For over 1,000 years, from roughly the 8th century until 1870, the Pope wasn't just the spiritual head of the Catholic Church. He was also the absolute temporal monarch of a significant chunk of central Italy.
Like any other king or duke of the time.
Pretty much. And in that role as a civil sovereign, the Pope, like other rulers, accepted and routinely exercised the state's power to inflict capital punishment.
But this wasn't for heresy, like with the Inquisition.
Not primarily. This was for regular civil and criminal offenses committed within the Papal States. Murder, robbery, treason, banditry, the kinds of crimes any government dealt with. The Pope, acting as head of state, signed death warrants.
And the methods used. Our sources suggest they weren't just standard execution methods. They were particularly brutal.
Yes. The methods used in the Papal States are noteworthy. While they did use the axe and the noose, and later even adopted the guillotine after the French introduced it, they're also known for a particularly gruesome method called the mazzatello.
What on earth was that?
It was typically reserved for what were considered especially heinous crimes. It involved the executioner striking the condemned person on the head with a large, heavy mallet, the mazzatello.
So bludgeoning them.
The blow was intended to stun or crush the skull, but it didn't always kill instantly. Then, while the person was stunned or dying, the executioner would cut their throat.
My goodness. Why such a brutal, drawn-out method?
It seems to have been about demonstrating the absolute power and righteous anger of the state, embodied by the Pope as sovereign. It was public spectacle designed to inspire terror and awe, not just swift justice. It speaks volumes about the conception of justice in the Papal States. It could be deliberately cruel and ritualistic.
And this wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a regular part of the justice system.
Oh, yes. We even have records. Our sources point to one specific individual, Giovanni Battista Bugatti.
Who was he?
He was the official executioner of the Papal States for an incredibly long time, from 1796 right up until 1861.
And his record?
His personal diary records that he carried out 516 executions himself.
516?
Yes. That number really underscores that capital punishment wasn't just some theoretical right the Pope held. It was an active, functioning, regular part of his government for centuries, right alongside other European monarchies.
What's striking is how late this continued, right up until the very end of the Papal States as a territory.
Absolutely. The last official execution carried out by the civil authority of the Papal States happened on July 9, 1870. The method used was the guillotine.
July 1870, and what happened soon after that?
Just 2 months later, in September 1870, troops fighting for the unification of Italy breached the walls of Rome and captured the city. That event effectively ended the Pope's temporal rule and dismantled the Papal States as a political entity.
The timing seems critical here. The executions stopped because the Pope lost his political power to carry them out.
That's precisely the argument the sources make. The papal government didn't have a theological change of heart about the death penalty in 1870. They didn't abolish it. Their power to enact it was forcibly taken away by Italian nationalism.
So the end of papal executions was a political event, not a moral or theological one at that time.
Exactly. The Pope, as sovereign, exercised the right to kill until the moment that sovereignty was stripped from him. And it's also worth noting, during the 19th century, when abolitionist movements were gaining ground elsewhere in Europe, the Papal State remained firmly committed to capital punishment. There was no internal push from the church leadership at that time to join the abolitionist cause.
So the loss of that temporal power in 1870 was almost necessary, perhaps, for the later theological shift.
It created the space. By removing the Pope from the day-to-day business of governing and executing criminals, it allowed the church, over subsequent decades, to develop a theological perspective detached from the immediate responsibilities of state power.
But even after 1870, the idea didn't vanish completely.
Well, interestingly, when the modern Vatican City-State was created by the Lateran Treaty in 1929, becoming a tiny, independent, sovereign entity again,
Yes.
its fundamental law actually included the death penalty, specifically for the crime of attempting to assassinate the Pope.
Really, as late as 1929?
Yes. It was never actually used in the new Vatican City, but the legal provision remained on the books. It wasn't quietly removed until 1969. Almost a century after the fall of the Papal States. The ghost of that state power lingered for a long time.
Okay, let's move into the 20th century. The landscape is totally different now. The church doesn't have that same kind of direct state power, but it's a major global institution, a diplomatic force.
Right. And it's facing these unprecedented challenges: totalitarian regimes, world wars, the Holocaust, Cold War proxy conflicts.
And this period, according to our sources, is marked by some significant institutional failures, a tendency towards pragmatic caution, what's termed realpolitik.
Yes, this is where we see that historical impulse. The instinct to protect the institution itself, its structures, its legal status, its personnel, often seems to override the call for prophetic moral witness against injustice.
The priority becomes institutional survival, sometimes at the cost of speaking out.
That's the criticism, yes. Protecting the church's ability to operate its schools, hospitals, dioceses sometimes seemed more important than loudly condemning regimes, even when those regimes were committing horrific atrocities.
And the prime example often cited is the Reichskonkordat of 1933, the agreement with Nazi Germany.
It's certainly a key case study. This concordat, or treaty, was negotiated between the Vatican, largely represented by Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who would later become Pope Pius XII, and Hitler's newly established Nazi government.
What did it do? What was the deal?
Essentially, the Nazi regime guaranteed certain rights for the Catholic Church in Germany: the freedom to run its schools, youth groups, maintain its property, practice its faith, appoint bishops, etc.
And in return?
In return, the Church agreed to effectively withdraw from political activity. Catholic clergy and church-affiliated organizations were to refrain from political interference.
What was the Vatican's motive?
Just survival.
The institutional motive seems clear: secure the legal standing and operational freedom of the church within what was obviously becoming a dangerous and unpredictable totalitarian state. Protect the flock and the structures.
But the consequence, the criticism, is that this led to silence, particularly during the Holocaust. That's the heart of the controversy surrounding Pius XII. Critics argue that despite the Vatican receiving credible, extensive intelligence about the systematic persecution and eventual mass murder of European Jews, Pope Pius XII maintained a public stance of official Vatican neutrality throughout the war. He condemned atrocities in general terms, but rarely, if ever, singled out the Nazis or specifically defended the Jewish people being targeted for genocide.
Why the silence, according to the critics?
The argument is that this calculated silence prioritized institutional survival, avoiding direct confrontation with the Nazis that might endanger Catholics or church property, and perhaps focus more on protecting Catholics, including Jewish converts to Catholicism, rather than speaking out universally for all victims.
So a failure of prophetic witness, putting the institution ahead of a universal moral obligation.
That's the strong critique, yes, that it represented a catastrophic moral failure rooted in that pragmatic institutional self-preservation instinct. Defenders, of course, argue he worked behind the scenes, but the public silence remains deeply controversial.
And this pattern of institutional caution, prioritizing non-confrontation, did it repeat elsewhere?
Our sources suggest it did, tragically. We see echoes of it decades later in Latin America, for instance, during the Argentine Dirty War that began in 1976.
What was the situation there?
You had a right-wing military junta that seized power, claiming to be defending Argentina and Catholic values from godless communism,
While simultaneously
engaging in the systematic kidnapping, torture, and murder of thousands of suspected leftists, intellectuals, unionists, students anyone deemed subversive, disappeared.
And the church hierarchy's response?
Largely, again, public silence or very cautious statements. The hierarchy seemed reluctant to openly challenge a regime that claimed to be Catholic and anti-communist, fearing reprisals against the church itself.
So instead of publicly condemning the disappearances and torture,
The focus was often on private lobbying, quiet diplomacy, helping individual families in some cases, but also sometimes getting drawn into administrative tasks that seemed to normalize the situation.
like what?
According to some accounts, bishops might be asked by the regime to certify whether certain detainees were genuinely religious people or maybe subversives or spies.
Wow. So working within the regime's framework instead of fundamentally challenging its legitimacy.
That's the critique, that the pattern held. Prioritize institutional non-confrontation and preservation over a clear public moral stand against state terror, even when that terror was being inflicted by a supposedly Catholic government.
It seems like it took the sheer horror of the 20th century, these world wars, the Holocaust, the dirty wars, to finally force a really fundamental theological shift within the church, away from justifying violence.
Yes, the trauma was undeniable. The scale of modern industrial warfare and totalitarian violence seemed to break the old frameworks. A moral revolution began to brew, particularly in the post-World War II era.
Where did this start to become official teaching?
A key moment was Pope St. John XXIII's encyclical Pacem Terris, Peace on Earth in 1963.
What did it say?
It laid a new foundation. It argued passionately that true and lasting peace couldn't be based on military might or balance of power, but had to be built on truth, justice, charity, and liberty. Crucially, it also acknowledged that in the nuclear age, the traditional just war calculations about proportion, whether the good outweighs the harm, were becoming almost impossible. Nuclear war couldn't be proportional.
So it questioned the applicability of just war in the modern world.
It certainly pointed in that direction, but the really landmark change came just a couple of years later during the Second Vatican Council.
Vatican II, which document are we talking about?
Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope, issued in 1965. This document called for an entirely new attitude toward war.
An entirely new attitude. What did that mean in practice?
It signaled a significant break from the historical reliance on just war theory as the primary way Catholics thought about conflict. While not completely discarding just war, Gaudium et Spes tightened the conditions so much, especially regarding the indiscriminate nature of modern weapons, that actually justifying a war under those criteria became incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
So it raised the bar dramatically.
Dramatically. And even more importantly, for the first time in official Catholic teaching at such a high level, Gaudium et Spes explicitly affirmed principled nonviolence as a legitimate and faithful Catholic option.
So conscientious objection, pacifism,
Yeah.
these were now formally recognized.
Yes. It moved the church from primarily focusing on when violence could be justified to actively promoting nonviolence as a positive gospel value and a legitimate path for Catholics. That was a huge shift.
And this trajectory, this increasing rejection of violence, it culminates quite recently, doesn't it? Extending beyond war to the death penalty itself.
Absolutely. The final piece, in a way, was put in place by Pope Francis in 2018.
What did he do?
He formally revised the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the official summary of church teaching specifically regarding capital punishment.
And the new teaching.
It's absolute. The Catechism now declares that the death penalty is inadmissible in all circumstances. Full stop.
Inadmissible, not just usually wrong or rarely necessary, but fundamentally unacceptable.
Exactly. It's a complete rejection. This definitively breaks from centuries of previous church teaching and practice, including the era of the Papal States, where the Pope himself ordered executions.
What's the reason given? What's the theological basis for calling it inadmissible?
The justification rests squarely on human dignity. The Revised Catechism argues that the death penalty constitutes an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person.
So human dignity is now seen as this absolute value that the state simply cannot override, no matter how terrible the crime.
That's the core of the argument, that every person possesses an inherent dignity given by God that cannot be forfeited, even by committing heinous acts. And the state taking a life, even a guilty one, violates that fundamental dignity. It marks the complete theological abandonment of the right to execute the very right the papacy held onto until it was politically forced to relinquish it in 1870. The moral revolution seems complete.
So we've traced this immense, often contradictory journey, from pacifism to just war to holy war, state executions, complicity, and finally this modern revolution towards nonviolence and inherent human dignity. Given this history, how does the Church reckon with its past?
That reckoning is crucial, and it's something the Church, particularly from the late 20th century onwards, has actively engaged in. Our sources talk about this as a necessary process of institutional relegitimation.
Relegitimation, meaning regaining moral credibility.
Exactly. How can the Church credibly preach peace and human rights today if it doesn't acknowledge the times it failed to uphold those values, or even actively violated them?
And Pope John Paul II was central to this, wasn't he, with his apologies?
Very much so. He made confronting the Church's historical failings a major theme of his pontificate. This culminated dramatically during the Great Jubilee year in 2000.
What happened then?
On March 12, 2000, he led a solemn day of prayer for forgiveness at St. Peter's Basilica. It involved cardinals and bishops specifically acknowledging and asking forgiveness for sins committed by members of the Church throughout history.
Were these specific apologies, not just general regrets?
Oh, they were quite specific over the course of his papacy and leading up to that event. He issued or referenced apologies for over 100 historical wrongs.
Such as?
Things like the Church's role in the African slave trade, the often brutal treatment of indigenous peoples during colonization, religious wars, the Inquisition, the cruel burning of reformers like Jan Hus, the disastrous sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, and very significantly, acknowledging the inactivity and silence of many Catholics during the Holocaust.
So a direct confrontation with that mysterium iniquitatis, the mystery of iniquity within the institution itself.
Yes. The goal was to purify the Church's memory, acknowledge the sins committed in the name of truth or unity, and seek reconciliation.
And this process hasn't stopped. Pope Francis has continued it.
He certainly has. You see it, for example, in his apologies in Canada for the abuses and cultural destruction perpetrated through the church-run Indian residential school system.
And he emphasized it's not just about words.
Right. He stressed that genuine reconciliation requires more than apology. It demands sustained action, humility, and heart. It's an ongoing process.
So the institutional purpose behind this public reckoning is clear. You have to own the past to have moral authority in the present.
Precisely. An institution that once blessed crusades and relied on the secular arm to burn heretics needs to confront that history honestly if it wants to be taken seriously as a global advocate for peace, dialogue, and human dignity today.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We've seen this absolute transformation from Augustine trying to restrict war, to Urban II making it holy, to popes acting as executioners, then the silence of the 20th century, and finally Francis declaring all state killing inadmissible based on human dignity. It's a dizzying arc.
It truly is.
So thinking about the Church's moral authority today, is it completely shot because of this history? Or has the recent transformation redeemed it?
I don't think the sources suggest it's completely compromised, but it's definitely profoundly informed by that history. The current strong commitment to nonviolence, diplomacy, and the absolute value of human life is real, and it's arguably rooted in the painful lessons learned from those past failures.
But the shadow remains.
The shadow remains, particularly that historical tendency towards institutional self-preservation. The realpolitik we saw in the 20th century, prioritizing the institution's safety and status over prophetic witness.
That shows how easily fear or perceived threats can lead to compromising on those universal moral principles.
Exactly. It highlights an ongoing tension. The moral revolution in teaching might be complete, but the credibility of that teaching depends on consistent action. especially when faced with pressure.
So the commitment to human dignity is the official line, but it needs to be constantly demonstrated through action, actively departing from that historical pattern of pragmatic silence when things get tough.
That seems to be the takeaway. The mission for peace needs to be exercised with, as Pope Francis said, humility and heart, and a clear willingness to challenge injustice, even when it's uncomfortable or risky for the institution itself. The real test is whether the current theological stance can hold firm against serious political pressure or threats.
And understanding this whole sweep of history, for you listening, it really shows how theological ideas, even ones intended to be restrictive, like just war, can be manipulated over time for political ends.
Yeah, whether it's redefining legitimate authority to empower popes or using the secular arm fiction to outsource executions, it's a cautionary tale about power and justification.
It really underscores why constant scrutiny, both internal and external, of powerful institutions and their justifications is so necessary.
And that brings us to maybe the most provocative final thought that emerges from this history. We talked about how the big shift towards nonviolence and rejecting the death penalty really only gained traction after the Church lost its temporal power in 1870.
Right. Losing the Papal States created the distance needed for that theological reevaluation based on human dignity.
So the question we're left with is this. If losing state power was a key prerequisite for this moral revolution, what happens if, hypothetically, the Church were to regain significant political power or influence in some future context?
Does that hard-won commitment to absolute human dignity remain unshakable?
Or does that historical pattern, the instinct for institutional self-preservation, the pragmatic compromises we saw when facing threats in the 20th century, does that resurface when the institution feels genuinely endangered by powerful, perhaps violent forces?
The Church's credibility, then, is something constantly being tested and verified through its actions today.
Exactly. And that's the history and the ongoing question that you, the listener, need to keep in mind as you observe the Church's role in the world today.